Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we apply the philosophy of objectivism to basically everything. And I guess the other day I got into it a little bit with James Valiant on the idea of voting rights. Is voting a right? Now, this is something that probably 99.9% of the people out there would say, of course it is. That's how we protect our democracy. Our government has to be more or less controlled by the people, and there's something to be said for that. Certainly, one of the ways that we control our government is by voting in those who represent us. But is it a right in the sense of the word of a complete and total inviolable freedom of action that travels with us wherever we go? To unpack this, or help me unpack this, I'm sure we might have slightly different perspectives on this. You can let me know. Nicolas Krusek, who's been with us on a number of shows, he helps unpack the artistry of music, and he has some great things to say about that, and great things to say about pretty much everything I've heard him talk about. So, Nicolas, what say you on a topic like this? This is a pretty complicated topic, it seems.
It is, and really, voting shouldn't be as important as it is today. So let me explain what I mean. A lot of people, many people that I know, they look upon voting with a kind of superstitious awe. And one thing that I often hear people say, older people as well as younger people, is they think of voting as being synonymous with our freedom. They say, well, voting, that's how we exercise our freedom. I beg your pardon. No, voting is not how we exercise our freedom. The way you exercise your freedom is by living, by working, by being productive, and by trading the products of your labor with other people without impediments and without restrictions from the government. If we lived in a free society, if we lived in a laissez-faire society where the government was strictly limited to only protecting individual rights, then voting would be a strictly marginal question. But because we lived in a mixed economy, because we live in a world which is basically this battleground of warring pressure groups, the only way that people can seize some temporary political powers and promote their own interests as against the interests of all other groups out there is by voting their particular merry band of crooks into office. So that's why voting has become so important among most people. It has to do with this warfare between different groups. So people will say, well, the only way to fix society is to vote liberals into office or to vote conservatives into office. And this leads to all sorts of confusion and all sorts of misunderstandings. Now, yes, it's true that and we can get into this in a moment, it's true that for adults in our society, there is a certain legitimate claim that voting is a right that all people should hold equally. But my point is that voting shouldn't be as central, it shouldn't be as important as it is, where people associate or think of voting in connection with democracy or with freedom.
So as you suggest, so as you suggested, a mixed economy, which creates a regulatory where it has some controls and some freedoms. The controlled aspect of the economy creates the necessity for you to gather into gangs in order to gain control of that aspect of the economy. Pressure groups and lobbying, as you said, as a result of this sort of regulatory state. In which case,
not just the economy, but also cultural aspects, things like gay marriage,
right.
Abortion,
so
whatever.
Once you allow the government the right to control one aspect of our lives, it enables it to control every other aspect of our lives in the name of the public good. And then it's in your interests to organize into some form of pressure group, and voting becomes vital because your life is literally in the hands of these bureaucrats, but you've put them in the hands of these bureaucrats. And clearly the way out of this is a laissez-faire society where actually just living is the way you get ahead, and not the right person in government. But when we see now the left wants to expand the franchise in the name of democracy, claiming that this voting right not only should extend to non-citizens and people who are not even of the age of majority, let's say 16 years of age, people who've never lived on their own. Can you say that they are consistently pursuing a concept of voting as a right by expanding the franchise in a way that seems a little bit irrational?
Irrational to be sure. So we need to define very clearly who should vote. Certainly any adult citizen of a country should be allowed to vote. Just to give you a couple of statistics. So my country, Canada, was technically created in 1867 with the British North America Act. And at that time, any male citizens aged 21 and above could vote. Then about a decade later, in 1876, there was this law passed. It was the so-called Indian Act, which was referring to our native people, who they were allowed to vote only if they willingly gave up their, quote, Indian status. Now, getting into the 20th century, gradually during the period of World War I, women were progressively allowed to vote, but in a piecemeal fashion. So during World War I, there was a law passed saying that women who served in the armed forces could vote. Women who served in the armed forces alongside men could vote. It wasn't until actually a couple of years later, in 1920, that all women were allowed to vote. Not until after World War II were Asian Canadians allowed to vote. That was in 1948. And then all Native people, regardless of whether they had Indian status or not, weren't allowed to vote until the 1960s. So, wow. Of course, this raises a whole host of and perhaps you can fill us a little bit on the American history or the American context, but nonetheless, I think the principle here is that adults of whatever the age of majority is, I think right now in Canada it's 18, should be allowed to vote, regardless of where they come from, whether they come from Asia, whether they were born here, whether they're of native descent or European descent, or whether they're Black or whatever, should be allowed to vote. I don't really see any rationale in lowering the voting age. So, for example, like right now in Canada, the drinking age is 19. I think in most states, the drinking age is 20 or 21.
21.
I don't really see the logic of having the legal drinking age be different from the legal voting age or anything else, driving or whatever. I think there should be some sort of consistency there, as well as the age for having consensual intercourse or whatever. Like once we decide that at such and such an age you are considered an adult, you are legally considered an adult, that should basically entail everything. I don't really see the point of making finer distinctions there. But certainly voting should be limited to citizens. Like if I were to go to the United States on vacation or to live or work for such a time, I should not be allowed to vote in the United States because I'm not a US citizen. I'm a Canadian citizen. And if you were to come to Canada, say to film a movie for a couple of months or a TV show, you shouldn't be allowed to vote in Canada because you're not a Canadian citizen.
Well, wait a minute. So wait a minute. Canada takes 23% of my income when I go work over there. So in many respects, I have invested more in the infrastructure of Canada than most Canadians have, just in about a decade than most Canadians have in their entire life.
Oh, true enough. True enough. So you actually, oh, does that make you a stakeholder? As people misuse that term nowadays.
Yeah, I think it does. I think you're right about that. Yeah, with respect to American voting rights, I believe there were, we have a federalist system here where the states are supposed to make their own rules with respect to voting. And there were states early on that allowed women to vote, provided they met certain qualifications. The thinking at the time was that women were dependents on men and would tend to vote the way that the men voted because they were financially dependent on them. So a propertied woman could vote in various states and in certain territories as well. Utah, Wyoming, I believe once they opened up as territories were places where women could vote. I think New Jersey might have had a female vote almost from its inception. I could be wrong about some of those dates. Of course, it became wider and more open after the suffragette movement in the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century. Now, we say citizens should vote, and I agree with you, citizens should vote. I don't think the vote should be lowered to 60, and I think that certainly favors the left. As James Valiant quoted Winston Churchill, if you're under 30 and not a quote unquote liberal, we'll use it in their terms, you don't have a heart. If you're over 30 and not a conservative, you don't have a brain. There's something to that. Of course, the 16-year-old doesn't have the context to be able to apply principles of right, principles of government, doesn't understand the context and doesn't know how to apply them to their own life. So I think that's a disastrously irrational thing that serves the left, of course, as do migrants coming from other countries that may embrace a more socialist attitude, also sort of serves them. But I think there should be qualifications for citizenship. I don't think just being born here should make you a citizen. I think you have to understand the nature of the values, Americanism, if you will. You have to understand what our form of government is and what it means. And you cannot, I think, as a citizen, be able to vote anyone else's property away. I think there should be strictures like that when we're talking about voting. What say you with respect to these things that I brought up?
Well, I think the most important point that you just brought up is, yes, there should be certain, and this comes down again to limitations on the power of government. You shouldn't be able to vote somebody else's property or somebody else's rights away. And that really comes down to clearly defining, this is the purpose of a constitution, clearly defining what a government can do and what a government can't do. Now, I haven't really thought about whether someone should automatically be a citizen just by virtue of being born in a country. I think my parents were immigrants. They came from Europe in 1968. They became citizens, and then I was born in this. My sister and I were born here. Two, recently arrived people who'd become Canadian citizens. So. Now, would you say that if somebody is born in a country and their parents are both citizens, does that change something? Should they automatically become a citizen? Or even there, should there be some sort of process of, do you understand the founding principles of the country? Do you understand the rights and responsibilities, etc.?
No, I haven't thought this through, so I'm sure I'm going to get some blowback on it. But I certainly think that becoming a citizen willfully, as your parents did, means they consciously embraced the values of the country they were going to. They had to learn something about the country and how the country operated. They had to pass a test in order to get in. And that more or less assured, these values are values that I accept. Now, if I get born into that country and I embrace values that are antithetical to that country, to the political, economic, and moral framework of that country, should I have a right to vote in those things that are antithetical to that? Certainly, if they're antithetical to rights, human sovereignty, as say communism is, I think the Communist Party should be banned. I think they can create their communes and create business structures in a free society, however they choose as voluntary individuals. But should they have the right to vote in ideals that have at their core the initiation of force against other people? I think not. And a person who embraces that ideal should not have political power, in my view. And they're not going to be harmed by not having political power if the politics in general embraces individual rights. They may not have the power to vote, but they're going to have perfectly unscathed sovereignty to do as they please, provided it doesn't hurt somebody else.
Absolutely. Now, why do so many immigrants come to North America, to Canada, to the United States? Well, my parents came to Canada in 1968. They came in the summer when the Soviet scum rolled their tanks into the streets of Prague. So my parents wanted to get out of Czechoslovakia. They wanted to get the hell away from the Soviet socialist crap and come to a country that was freer, where they would have right. My parents were never particularly politically savvy, but they sensed this is not the kind of environment we want to raise a family, and we want to come to a country where there aren't armed soldiers and tanks rolling through the streets. I imagine probably a lot of immigrants who come to the United States, whether it's from Central America or South America, they're trying to escape a bad situation. They're trying to escape some kind of political instability, corruption. So surely they would want to come to embrace a system that's better than what they're leaving behind. Now, that actually brings up another very important point. I think this is actually one of the best arguments against letting non-citizens vote in a country, because I think that could generate hostility against immigration. I think somebody should definitely become a citizen, go through the process of becoming a citizen before they're allowed to vote. But here's an argument that we often hear from people on the right who are against immigration. They often say, well, we shouldn't allow too many of these immigrants in because they come into our country and they vote for liberal policies, progressive policies that are anti-property rights, anti-freedom, anti-capitalism, or whatever. I think that's really problematic argument, because if you actually look at all the major parties, whether it's in the United States or the major parties in Canada, they're all motivated. All the major political parties are motivated by altruism. They're all motivated by collectivism and statism. So actually, it doesn't really matter which party you vote for. It doesn't matter whether you vote for liberals, whether you're voting for conservatives. One way or the other, you're voting for statists and collectivists. So I don't think that's really a legitimate argument for keeping immigrants out. Give us a party that's actually worth voting for. Give us a party that actually upholds individual rights, and then we can talk about whether or not we should let immigrants into the country to vote.
I mean, they certainly do use that, and they point to the politics in South and Central America, which definitely tend towards authoritarian leftism, which many of them are fleeing. Now, some of them may hold those ideals as still appropriate, even though they're fleeing them, and vote in that direction. But for the most part, many of the immigrants that I talk to actually are closer to the Americanism that I think is appropriate than most Americans. So we objectivists are very different than the conservatives or the left. I think both sides are exploiting the immigration issue for their own benefit. The left is trying to increase their demographic. The right is trying to exercise its ideal, which is nationalism and sort of a white centrist corporatism. And I'm about to release a video on immigration, believe that, freedom of action extends to your capacity to move from one place to another to improve your condition. I think immigration is a right. I don't think people claim you can't come into our country. It's not your country. You don't own the country. You own your home, you own whatever property you have, but you don't own the country. Certainly someone can't come in and commit violence in the country because we have laws that are stipulated, and there's sort of a hard wall against violence. But otherwise, a person coming here to lift up their standard of living is a rather good thing. It's a noble thing, and if they're working to do that and not being a burden on the system, not taking advantage of our social welfare state, which is to me the only valid argument against immigration, is that we have a social welfare state, pressure groups that have to leverage the social welfare state, immigrants become another drain on the productive when they come in and they use the apparatus of the welfare state, and they can't help it because it's everywhere.
But technically, that's not an argument against immigration. It's an argument against the welfare state.
Welfare state,
abolish
yes.
the welfare state, abolish socialized medicine, and all of that. And there's really no argument against immigration.
I agree with you. But so what we've established so far is voting is definitely a type of right, but it's only to citizens, right, of a certain age, and there should be standards with respect to the person who exercises the right to vote. There should be standards of knowledge. I think everybody should read at least Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, something by Mises, something by Rand, in order to get a
Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson.
Hazlitt wasn't an economist, but he sure understood the principles of economy, right? Wrote about them very eloquently, makes it understandable for laymen like me. So somebody like that, if you just ingest their principles and digest them, no politician out there can demagogue you again. It's actually strength. It's actually power. So there should be conditions for voting, one of which is citizenship. And I think citizenship doesn't necessarily depend on being naturally born into the country, but on other qualifications. We have a couple of go ahead before we get to the super. I
just want to address the question of qualifications. Now, in principle, I like the idea that one should have or should demonstrate knowledge of, some basic knowledge of politics, economics, social functioning before being allowed to vote. Would that help us in our present situation, though? Because suppose you had to take an exam in order to be able to vote, a certain knowledge exam. Nowadays, who would administer such an exam? Probably some government goons whose motive would be to preserve the status quo. So that wouldn't help us at all. The only way we can really help society is by educating people, getting these good ideas out there as we're doing right now.
And we have a long, long road to hoe because the system is utterly corrupt. And it starts in academia, in my opinion. Regina with €2. Thank you, Regina. Kiana Pellegrino, $5. Voting is important, but isn't voting more of a privilege than a right? I mean, that's sort of interesting. That's sort of an interesting thing. You could say in a sense that privilege is a qualified type of right. Sure, it has stipulations around it that rights don't. Rights are inviolable, and there's no buts to a right.
Right.
You can't say this is an inviolable right, but the general welfare trumps it. No, but voting is something different. Kathleen says she's been a member for 12 months. Thank you, Kathleen. Great to see Nicholas hosting all these fantastic shows. An excellent interviewer and host. Look at that. Some Nicholas love there. Awesome. Roland Horvath, or €5.99. I wouldn't mind living in a society where I didn't get to vote, as long as I didn't get to pay taxes either. Now, that's interesting.
That is an interesting point. Yeah.
I mean, well, in a perfect objectivist world, taxes would be a voluntary phenomenon. So, and I think exercising the vote is relatively important. Especially, it's vital now. It's relatively important, but certainly not as important in a totally free society. Adherent of Lady Columbia, $5. Left's universalism and lust for power so bad. Here in Illinois, my sweaty, hippo-sized governor signed bill that allows non-citizens to become cops. Well, now, what do you think of that? Because also I think in the United States as a whole, non-citizens can join the military service, and through that military service, get a bit of a pathway to citizenship. Do you find this serving in law enforcement as an interesting means of facilitating citizenship and involvement in your community?
So I probably have to delve into this a little bit more and maybe get some actual legal perspective from James Valiant. But that concerns me when you consider that people who work in the military and who work in law enforcement have a legal monopoly on the use of force. I'd be very concerned about somebody having a monopoly over the use of force over me, who was not a citizen of my country. That concerns me.
But they still have to obey the laws of the land. So they're still subject to those laws. And certainly nowadays, when we have laws that are subjective and flexible, we've embedded the initiation of force in our system in all kinds of regulations that give police undue authority over our lives. That certainly has attracted a crop of people into the police force that are rather unsavory. So part of the reason we have so many fatal run-ins with police officers is not just the poor training, but it's also because a certain personality is attracted to a jackboot organization, which it's sort of becoming. But if Renzo Gracie wanted to become a police officer, I'm sure he's a citizen here of the United States, as a red belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm sure he'll be able to diffuse most conflicts without having to use his weapon, and teach others how to do the same. And for me, that's a positive. That's a good thing. But you make an interesting point. Jonathan Honig for 99 twice. Thank you, Jonathan, for watching the show. Now, Daniel says something very interesting. He just is sort of jumping off of what I said earlier. Wyoming also refused to join the Union if women's suffrage wouldn't be preserved. Isn't that interesting? It was exercised in the territory. We'll remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without women. People don't understand this about the United States. They've jerry-rigged the history of the United States for people to believe that all these human demographics were oppressed, and they were. We can't deny that. But they don't understand that there's a great deal of nuance to a lot of their arguments. So the United States isn't just a villain. It's a mixed thing. It's a mixed phenomenon of amazing ideals that we've been struggling to meet up to for over 100 years, and some pretty horrible old world, I think, illiberal institutions that remained for a while. But they don't understand that in pockets, the United States was pretty doggone greater than pretty much any place on earth. Roland Horvath, go ahead.
I just wanted to address, I know we're getting close to the hour, but one last point that I wanted to address. This argument that voting is a duty, that if you're a citizen of a certain age, that you have a duty or a responsibility to vote, i.e. that you are immoral if you don't accept the responsibility of voting. Well, what do you think of that argument? Which I hear from many people that I know.
I think in today's day and age, it is probably the most moral thing you could probably do is not vote. When you have a choice between Biden, Trump, and some libertarian schmo, you have no choice. I mean, if you think that, you know, you should make your voice heard, your minuscule voice heard, you could say, you know, I vote for Mark Pellegrino for the Capitalist Party or something like that. If you if you think that's valid. Otherwise, standing down is appropriate. I think it's moral. What say you to that?
Well, I went for years and years where I didn't bother voting just because I hated all the parties and I hated all the candidates so much. I only started voting some years ago, and that's just because Justin Trudeau is such a woke little weasel that I have to vote against him at the very least.
Oh, I
So
despise that guy.
I'm doing my part for Canada by casting a vote against Justin Trudeau.
And you know what? I did the same thing in the past two presidential elections by voting for the Libertarian candidate, one of whom didn't know where Aleppo is, and the other was just a raging schmo. But I thought, you know what? Less of a schmo than the two people out there that are standing for the establishment. Well, today, folks, the quote unquote informal collective, which will be coming to you in 4 minutes, now has a title. It is called The Reality Show. And the reality show will be coming up to you in 4 minutes, folks. And the topic will be the causes of California crime crisis. I might have to sit in on this since I live in California. I've experienced some of this stuff firsthand, and I see the exodus of even natives. And many of my friends who never even thought about moving out of state are now considering moving out of state. I've, of course, been considering it for the past 2 years. Well, Nicholas, it's been great talking with you. Do you have anything to add before we sign off?
Nope, but it's been a great discussion. Thank you very much, Mark.
I think so too, folks. And so tune into the reality show coming up in a couple of minutes. And always remember to check your premises. Peace.